It's really nice. If you know me, if you know my channel, you know I don't like long intros, so let's get right into it. The first thing you want to do to get your mix to sound less muddy, and I know this sounds really obvious, is start off with really good quality sound recordings. So if you're starting off with sound recordings that are like 7 or 8 out of 10, you know, you can kind of hear a motorbike revving in the background, you go, it's fine, you won't really hear it in the mix. The thing is, all those motorbikes revving and all those birds chirping and all that going on in all those recordings, especially if you're recording multiple instruments. So if you're miking up a guitar amp, if you're doing vocals, if you're doing multiple vocal takes, if you're doing drums as well, all those little like inconsistencies and all those noises here and there, they're all going to start to add up and you're going to hear them. Make sure the recordings are in tune. Tune your guitar before every take. I'm terrible at this. I'm so bad at, like, I'm pretty sure some of my songs, they have like out of tune notes, and I've listened back to it and I've been like, good lord, that is terrible, and it kills me. So learn from my mistakes. Make sure your guitars are in tune. Make sure your vocals are in tune. That means get a good singer. And make sure that everything's in time as well. One of the main reasons, you know, especially with the drums, one of the main reasons things sound off and muddy and not tight is because things are out of time. So if your guitars are playing like, you know, 10 milliseconds off with the drums, and you know, that's playing another 10 milliseconds off, everything starts to add up, and instead of hitting here, it's kind of hitting like across a little spectrum. I'll show you, I'll put an example up on the screen, you'll see what I mean. The second thing you want to do is have a purpose when you're mixing. So once you've got those good quality recordings, you want to make sure that you've got a purpose before you even touch the volumes, right? Before you touch anything, you want to have a purpose. You want to listen, actually listen to the track, listen to what you have, and start figuring out what you want to change. That kick is punching through too much. You know, those vocals are too loud in this section. Start thinking about what you want to change. Don't just go and add an EQ and compressor on because I told you to. Actually think about what you want to change. This is so important because this is what's going to make your mix actually pop, as opposed to just having a bunch of shit there that, you know, is kind of doing the job but not really hitting where you want it to. So take a listen, think about what you want it to sound like, and then do it. So obviously that's easier said than done, but the most basic example of that is something like, ooh, that snare is too loud for me. So what are you going to do? You're going to turn it down. Really simple. Now that obviously keeps going. You know, you could think those vocals are too dynamic for me. You know, she's too loud here, too soft here, so you put a compressor on it. But the vocals might not be too dynamic. They might be fine, so you don't need a compressor. It just depends on the certain scenario that you're recording. It's also really important to understand that some tracks don't need anything on it. I've recorded guitars before where I just leave it raw. I don't touch them, and it sounds perfect in the mix. It sounds exactly like I want it to. And if that works, it works. You don't have to add an EQ because they told you to add an EQ. You don't have to add reverb because they told you to add reverb. Just leave it. Just, if it sounds good, it sounds good. That's it. That's the most important rule. Have a purpose, and if it sounds good, it sounds good. So after you understand that you need a purpose with everything, the first thing you should tackle is the levels. So, you know, the snare's too loud, the vocals are too loud, you know, the kicks aren't hard enough, the guitars aren't loud enough, whatever. So start leveling it out. Start getting the levels right, because if you're starting to EQ and add effects before you do your levels, what's going to happen is everything's going to get amplified pretty much, and it's just going to sound like a mess, and you're going to try and fix it afterwards, and it's just going to be like duct tape on duct tape on duct tape. You don't want to be duct taping things. You just want to get the job right the first time. So if you start off with levels, that's starting off with your foundation, and then the next part of that, you know, you can add your EQ, you can add your compressor. My chain process usually looks like this. So I usually, first of all, I start with my levels and I get everything right. And the next thing I do after that is I start EQing things. So I start getting rid of those frequencies I don't like. I usually like rolling off a lot of high end. So, you know, especially hi-hats, I will roll off like all the way down to like 8 or 9. I don't like that. I don't like that sharpness. And then if I need to, I will add a compressor. I don't usually use compressor. You know, the main thing I use compressors on are vocals. I don't really use compressors on much of anything else. Sometimes guitar, sometimes drums, but honestly, a lot of the time you don't need it. That's me personally. That's just the mixes I do. That's just the kind of music I make. I don't need compressors on a lot of things. Then after that, you can start adding your effects. You can start adding your delay and your saturation or distortion, your reverb. You can start layering things. You can start double tracking and whatever. That's when you can start doing all that stuff. But make sure that you've got that, you know, leveling EQ compression down. So number 4 is frequency separation across track. A mistake that I used to make when I was writing a lot of rock and metal music was I used to track bass, but on top of that I used to track guitars and not cut off any of the low end. So what would happen is, as I would track guitars, I would be kind of using them to do the bass's work, if that makes sense. So I'd be using the guitar to do what the bass is supposed to be doing. And the result of that is that you're going to get this muddy, like the bass and guitar are just going to clash in the low end, and you don't want that. So if you're recording guitars, I would roll off a lot of the low end and just let the bass take care of that low end, right? Even if you've got 2 bass tracks, even if you've got a sub bass to take care of that low end, then you got another bass playing all the riffs and stuff, as an example, that's good. But you just want to make sure that you're not using the guitar to take care of the bass. And this goes for synths and vocals and everything else as well. Don't use the snare to do what the kick does. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, really obvious, right? So same thing with the synths. A lot of the time I'll have like 3 or 4 different synth tracks of the same synth, right? But you know, one of them I'll roll off all the low end, one of them I'll roll off the high end, one of them will just be like the mids. And then I'll EQ them differently, I'll reverb them differently, Now I can control what each like high end and low end is doing. So for example, I don't really like having much reverb on the low end. So when I go to that low end thing, I might just leave it dry. But then when I get to the high end, I might add a bit of delay, and then the mids, I might add some reverb just to get that nice and spacious. But if I was to just do the one synth once and just put reverb on that, that's going to reverb the high end, the low end, and the mids. And I don't want that because all the low end's going to get reverby and it's going to sound muddy and it's going to sound disgusting. So get your frequency separation right. So, you know, make sure that if you've got a guitar, your guitar's really just doing like the mids and the highs. Even if you do two guitar tracks and one's doing the mids and one's doing the highs, just separate the frequencies out, not as much as possible, but just enough so that you don't have things clashing. Enough so that, you know, the kick and the bass aren't clashing, right? The next thing you want to do is, I think this really pertains to me because I use a lot of reverb, but, you know, if you don't use a lot of reverb, that's fine. Reverb control is really important. If you got reverb flying on like 7, 8 different tracks, which I've reverb flying on like 20 tracks when I make music. But if you have reverb flying all over the place, it's really important that you control it and you don't let the reverb from, you know, track 7 through 10 to all affect each other. What I usually like to do is I usually like to put the reverb on a bus. Now, pretty much what a bus is it's just an external thing that allows you to like slowly mix the sound back into the original track. If you don't know what a bus is, go search it up. That was the worst explanation ever. When you put a reverb on the bus, it then allows you to EQ the reverb and sidechain it. So if you got a reverb on, let's say guitars, let's say you're happy with how the guitar sound, you want to put on reverb but it's sounding too muddy. So if you put the reverb on the bus and then you take out all of that low end from the guitar, what's happening is you've still got that low end on the guitar, but now the reverb is only focusing on the highs. The reverb is only doing that high end, and you're not getting that reverb on the low end, which is fantastic because it's not going to clash with the bass, it's not going to clash with the kick, and it's not going to clash with anything else down the low end, which is a really, really good way to go about it. And then you can sidechain it. So, you know, you don't have to do a full-on, like, you know, EDM sidechain where everything just drops. But you can do a soft sidechain, like the kick. You can do a soft sidechain to the vocals, or whatever you want. I usually like doing the kick and the vocals because those are the main things in the track. But you can sidechain it to the synths, you can sidechain it to whatever you're putting the reverb on it. If you take that reverb and you EQ and sidechain it, it's going to sound a bit more controlled and it's going to sound like it's a more part of the mix rather than just like floating off and doing its own thing. So it's going to help that mix sound tighter and less muddy. Now again, it's fine if you've got one reverb track, but if you've got reverb on the guitar and reverb on the vocals and reverb on the drums and reverb on the synths and reverb on the bass and reverb on everything, all those reverbs are going to clash together and you want to get them under control. So those are my 5 tips for making your mix sound less muddy, right? You want to make sure that everything's under control. The most important thing out of all of this is that you're starting with good quality sounds. If you start with a fart through a microphone, you're not going to get much better than a fart through a microphone. You're going to get a fart through a microphone with delay and reverb on it. That's what you're going to get. So make sure you have good quality sounds. Make sure that you've got a purpose when you're mixing. Don't just put on compression because I told you to put on compression. Don't just put on reverb because I told you to put on reverb. Put it on because you want it to sound more reverby. Put it on because you want it to sound a bit less dynamic for the compressor. Make sure you get your leveling right. That's your core bass. Make sure you get your frequency separation right, and of course after that make sure that you control your reverb. Those are my 5 tips for getting your mix to sound a lot less muddy. This is what works for me. It might not work for you. Everyone's got a different production style, but I hope this kind of helps steer you in the right direction and the right mindset on how to approach your mixes. I make video tutorials every Sunday on producing, composing. I do plenty of posting. I probably haven't had as much shit posting in my last 2 tutorials, but they will come back, I promise. If you like my content, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and like the video, and so hopefully more producers can see this video and help them get their mixes to sound less shit. Because I know as a beginner producer, it's really hard to get your mix perfect. If you like free sample packs, I'll have a sample pack with like 700 samples down in the description if you want to download it. That's it for today's tutorial. I will see you next week.